What does the ABC have in common with the Australian newspaper? What does the Australian Institute of Company Directors have in common with the left-wing think tank, the Australia Institute, where the Greens get a lot of their data from? That Australia is in a per capita recession, meaning that while the government will tell you that the economy is not in a recession because it is ever so slightly growing by 0.1 or 0.2 or 0.3%. The only reason that's happening is because the federal government is hiring, and state governments are hiring more public servants and giving them greater pay rises than the ones that anyone in the normal economy would actually be doing. It's also because the state governments, thanks to the money they get from the federal government, which of course is in part and mainly the GST, is turning around and spending a lot of money on infrastructure, but they're spending way beyond even the money that's coming in, meaning they are borrowing, meaning the collective debt of the states is now in line with the federal government, which, as I just showed you, is only going to go deeper in the hole from now until the 2060s. So if your wages have not kept up with the inflation that has been roaring for the past couple of years, if your wages have not kept up with the 12 interest rate rises under this government, then you're going backwards. And in fact, you have been going backwards not a little bit. In fact, you have been going backwards now for 6 quarters in a row. That is now a scenario where we are getting close to 2 full years of a recession in real Australia. Now, despite the fact that, let's show that number again, 1 million people have been added to the overall population, meaning that 1 million people are now paying more tax to the government that is now, of all of the money it gets, getting more money from individual taxpayers than it is anything else. This is hiding the reality of the Australian economy. It's not about the headlines they can tell you in Canberra, it's about what is actually happening in real Australia. And believe it or not, an economics reporter on the ABC will help point this out.
GDP is actually a pretty blunt kind of measure when it comes to economic performance. All it does is measure the amount of stuff we produce and consume. So, you know, there's an argument that it's a dumb way to keep yourself out of recession simply by adding more people into the economy, because it's not a real reflection of your economic performance. So if you strip that out, we've gone backwards for 6 consecutive quarters, which is not a great performance for the economy.
And the other thing, and why I don't think that Australians are going to be moved to think more warmly about the federal government because of what may or may not be happening with the federal budget, is, as we told you last night, there are more people than ever before who need to turn to a charity to find something to eat for themselves or their families. We know that people are going without food for themselves, for their kids. In fact, we spoke to the bloke from Turbans for Australia last night on our Town show that was in Melbourne about how many people need help from his organisation.
Young couples working full-time or part-time, or even 2 jobs, trying to put food on the table, to average pensioners and homeless people and others. So everyone in the society is suffering at the moment due to this rising cost of living.
So despite the fact that the federal budget now has more money than they intended to spend, meaning they have billions of dollars left over, there is no plan to give the charities that are taking care of the people at the absolute bottom of our economy a cent more, let alone any further changes for you or I, the actual engine room of the Australian budget, any changes to help you or I when it comes to cost of living. Which means that people like Jackie Lambie quite correctly say, I don't care what your budget number is, the reality is that when Australians are hurting, you are missing.
Nobody gives a stuff about a surplus, mate. I can assure you right now, people are doing it hard out there. Nobody's talking about a surplus, and if they were and they truly understood, they'd be saying, well, how about you put some of that surplus out to us so we can put bread and milk on the table for our kids and do that without raising the inflation. You know, surely with a surplus, people are really hurting out there, Carl. Honestly, give them more. Find a way to do it.
Principally, and most importantly, if they don't want to muck around when it comes to the inflation numbers, and they're going to say, well, if we sent people cheques, that'd cause trouble. Why not crack off $1 billion of the money that you have now been able to see, said that you have nowhere else to spend in the economy, and spend $1 billion of that extra money and give it to the charities of Australia as a one-off payment to help people who are in trouble today? Another reason why there won't be a political bounce out of the government telling you how amazing their economic responsibility is, because, again, we're not living in that world. As you know, the cost of living crisis leads to many lies that come out of the Prime Minister and the Treasurer. Now, despite the fact that friendly media will turn around and say that because the inflation rate is now the best it's been in a couple of years' time, that literally they posted, this was Channel 9, mission accomplished. But mission accomplished when it comes to inflation is just as fake as George W. Bush saying mission was accomplished in Iraq, a war that kept going for the best part of 10 more years. And let me explain. In fact, I won't explain. An economics reporter from Sky News in the UK, he explains beautifully why the headline number that gets all of the politicians excited to say we've got a 2 in front of it, and the media who wants to move on from this story because they're bored with it, is not felt by you and I. In fact, you see, it's not just about the last number they reported. He'll explain better than I can.
That's the cost of living crisis. Suddenly we went up from prices being around there to prices being there. And you don't really see that in this data, OK? Because inflation is really just measuring the difference between that and that. And if you look at those two lines, you're talking about a 2.3% change. That's the number we're talking about today. But for a lot of people, it's not about that. It's about the difference between this and that. And when you look at the difference between this and that, that's 20%.
See, that's the point. The 2 from this quarter is added to the 2 from the previous, to the 4 before. You get the point. This is the Australian version of that graph. Now, the government would want you to say, well, hang on, it's gone up and now it's coming back down. No. Every little one of these points, of course, you add together. So even though the number's going up, so say again, I'm just going to make it easier to understand. They might be 3s or 4s, and the very top is 5, and then 5 becomes 4, becomes 3, becomes 2. You add it all together, and prices are way higher than they were in 2020, where, yes, there was a pandemic, but more importantly, let's compare it to prices in 2019 or even 2021. If you started that journey when it comes to 2021 to today, all of that looks like it goes up and it comes down, but it's actually one on top of the other, 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 which is why the government gets no credit from those of us who are in the real world, who may not be playing the stock market like people did today, the people who don't have a business that means they can pay a top marginal tax rate of the company tax rate. Instead, they work for a business, meaning that depending on how much you earn, that's how much tax they take. On top of that, of course, there are millions of Australians whose superannuation is taken out of their wages. It's not their wages and superannuation. You see, that's the scenario for everyone in the government sector. But for everyone in the private sector, a very significant number of people have all the money they earn, and then the government takes some for your retirement. This government has got legislation which means they take more, meaning you are about to continue to get, under this government, a real decline in the amount of money that you get every fortnight or every month, that you then have to turn around and use that money to pay for things that cost way more than they did before they became the government, or try and pay off a house that's gone up 12 times in interest rates. So I don't care what the Canberra Gallery says about what happened today. In the real world, it's hurting as bad as it ever has.